Hello, creatures, and happy Halloween month. It's time for some more horror sound design, and in this video, cluster chords. For those of you who don't know, a cluster chord is a chord of notes that are very, very close together. Think chromatically close together, like they're offset by semitones instead of thirds, fifths, and sevenths and stuff like that. So if we have a cluster chord with a root note of C, it would be like C, C sharp, D, D sharp, F, F sharp, for instance, right? That could be a cluster chord. And they are used a lot in orchestras for very tense, very disturbing, very dissonant type of sound. And if you've seen The Shining, you'll know what I'm talking about, particularly with composers like Penderecki and Ligeti. They used clusters a lot. Now in this video, I'm going to explore making cluster chords for synthesized sounds instead of orchestral sounds because you can get the same sound with a few tricks. Now, when cluster chords are performed by string players or brass players or wind players or even choirs, each player is performing one note. And even though we can all hear these players play the same note and we go, okay, they're all playing notes, it's the same instrument, it has the same sound, each sound is actually going to be slightly different. Take strings, for instance. Each player is going to be playing slightly differently on the position of the strings at slightly different bow pressures. Some might be playing just slightly out of tune. Some of the violins may be a little brighter than others, and where the performers are actually sitting in the stage or in the chamber is going to also affect the sound in slight ways. Normally, when we hear this, we don't think about these differences because when we hear instruments like strings playing together, it sounds like strings are supposed to sound to us, so we don't think about these things. But synthesizers are a little bit too perfect. So a lot of these differences, a lot of these unique qualities to each voice of the sound in performers of an orchestra playing a cluster, we'll have to apply that individually to the sounds in the cluster chord that I'm designing. If I were to take a synthesizer and just use one instance of one and I play a chord, I can get it to sound like this. But that on its own doesn't really sound creepy or scary. If anything, it sounds kind of like a 5-year-old just slamming their hands on a keyboard. So, how do we get this to sound a bit more like this? The answer? Modulation. So let's get to it. There are a couple different approaches that I'm going to take to designing the cluster chords. The first one, I'm going to use a plugin called Unify. And I think it's a great plugin, but not all of you may have it. So I'm just going to use this to sort of demonstrate kind of the core elements of a cluster that I want to get across. And then I will go to designing one directly inside my DAW. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to assign an instrument. I have it loaded here. It's OBX. And it doesn't really matter what synthesizer you use. You could use something as simple as this or something a little bit more complex. And right now I've initialized the sound so that it's basically just a sawtooth. That's just a sawtooth with maximum filter, so we're going to bring the filter down. Bring some resonance up, maybe. Brightness there. Nope. A little bit of modulation, I think. And then I'm going to increase the attack and release. I want to make it slow, kind of like a slow string pad. And then I'm going to track it, so Now with this sound, I've decided to track it to the filter so that the higher pitch that we go, we can have a brighter sound, but it doesn't need to do that. We could get a higher pitch sound and filter it out just a little bit, but for right now, I am going to track it to right around there. I think it's appropriately bright right there before we go into the very high notes like up here. So this is our first sound, and the last thing I'm going to do is take our LFO and reduce the rate to somewhere around here and turn that off. Okay. And there we have our sound. This is where we're going to start. Now, remember what I mentioned about each player performing something just a little bit differently because of the qualities of acoustic instruments being just that imperfect? Well, we're going to apply that here. I'm going to left click and duplicate this 3 times, duplicate it a couple more times, and now I have a total of 6 sounds. And this is going to be a bit loud, but altogether, since it's the same preset, sounds like this. Okay, and now here's where things are going to get different. Right here is where I'm going to figure out what the chord is going to be. And I'm going to change the pitch of each of these. And I can do it a couple ways. In Unify, I can go over here and do this. So I can give a semitone offset effect. So that just raised the pitch of one of them up 1 semitone. 2, 3, and let's say 5 and 6. So that's like playing those 6 notes that I previewed earlier all at once, and I am just playing 1 note. That's like playing those notes that I played previously, and that's just from playing 1 note. So the other thing that I can do, if I were to bring each of this down to 0, is I can go into one of these instances of OBX and change the frequency from this to +1, +2, +3, and so forth. So now that we have each of the pitches of these instances set, we're going to go and detune this even further. So for right now, I'm just going to solo the first 2 just so I can hear the difference between them. And what I'm going to do here is change the tuning of this so that it's not at 440. Now this means it's at a perfect semitone distance if everything is set to the same tuning. So I'm going to listen to it, increase it, or decrease it a little bit. 436. Sounds interesting. There's a little bit of beating there. And this one, I'm going to increase or decrease a little bit. Interesting. So it's very flat. And this one, I'm actually going to increase. Okay, now each of these are set to a completely different tuning down here with the master tuning, as well as different offset tuning at the frequency level. But we're not done. Remember what I mentioned? The key to making this work for a synthesizer sound is modulation. So now we're going to go into the LFOs and change the settings. And for this, I'm going to listen to each sound separately before I listen to them all together. So for right now, let's listen to this, and let's change the LFO depth a bit. Let's also bring down the filter just a little bit. Maybe increase the resonance. Make this one a little bit more of a mellow sound. Maybe add some pulse width modulation to the sound. Somewhere around there might be nice. If I were to turn the LFO on here, what I'm going to do is change the rate a bit. So one of these sounds is has a little bit of vibrato that is at a faster rate than the other one, and because of that, the pitch variance is makes it a bit more dissonant in a way. So for this one, maybe we can make that a little bit darker too with the filter, so it's not too bright. Okay. Last one. And altogether, the sounds sound like this. Now, one thing that I didn't change with this, and this is just for OBX, but may not necessarily be for the one you're using, is that the modulation rate that I have here assigned to the mod wheel is different than the LFO that I just applied to all of them. So if I want to change the rate, I would have to go in to all of this and change the rate for that separately, which I can do real quick. Rate. Okay, and that is that sound. But even further, I can change the pitch bend range for each of these notes as well. So I'm going to leave the first one alone because I think 2 is fine, but next one will be 3. This one will be 4, 5 or 6, 7. I'm going to go a little crazy with this one. 11. This goes to 11. And so all of that together, there's no point in having each one be solo. Just have solo off. Get a very interesting sort of get a completely different chord when you do that, because each note is sliding up to a completely different destination. Some are sliding up even higher than the others, and when you pitch bend down, they're very close to each other. They're much closer than they are than in this chord right here. So we can fine-tune this even more. I want this filter to be a little closed down just a little bit more. But that is our cluster chord, and that is how you get these slight differences between each of the notes that you want to have in your cluster chord. But we can go even further than this. So I'm actually going to now see if I can add some LFO to the filter a little bit, if it's possible. Okay, and there is our cluster chord. Let's add some effects. I am a particular fan of the butterfly effect. We're going to bring back the feedback amount, and I'll use that one. Ooh, I'm digging where this is going. Oh, yeah. Ooh. Now, I am using butterfly effect, but as long as you have a reverb, it doesn't really matter which reverb you use. I just wanted to throw that on there because I like butterfly effect. But that is basically our cluster chord. There's our sound. That's it. That's it right there. And that is how you set it up in something like Unify. Now I'm going to show you how to set that up in your DAW. Now there's a benefit to having it done directly in your DAW as opposed to even this. And that benefit is you can have it so that you set up each of these sounds, but don't change the tuning, and you just have each of those tracks play a different note. And then if you were to play different notes, you can change what the chords actually are. With Unify, you've stacked it in a way where each of the sounds are going to pretty much play whatever frequency you've set it to in the preset for that instance. But you can change even that in your DAW. What I did going from Unify to Logic is I took each of the sounds that I made in Unify and saved them as presets. Now, if I started with one sound and made each of those changes, I can save those presets individually and then load them into here. Or I can set this up in my DAW, whatever DAW that you're using, and have each of those differences between the sounds already set up and ready to go. And what I have here is basically a set of notes where each one is already put in, but for all of them, they are at different positions. So altogether, they will look like this. The intervals are not the same. The chords are therefore not different. I can also change things like modulation and pitch bend completely independently, whereas with Unify, everything is set to the same channel, the same performance. All of it is going to be the same, even the curves, even the automation, right? But if I were to do it directly in my DAW, I can get these differences here. And this, I think, ultimately gives you the most control over this kind of sound as opposed to doing it in something like Unify. But something like Unify is a much more simple, much more straightforward, easy approach to setting something up like that. And by the way, you don't have to just do this with a normal sawtooth synth. You can do this with, say, samples of strings. The only thing is, unlike with actual recordings or actual sample libraries of performers playing on string instruments and then changing the pitch or changing the vibrato and stuff like that, if you were to apply digital vibrato to a sample of an acoustic instrument, it's not going to sound right because, well, like the reasons that I said earlier for why strings sound the way they do and synthesizers sound the way that they do. If you were to change the pitch of a recorded sample, everything in the sample is going to be slowed down or sped up. That includes what the room sounds like, what the bow pressure sounds like, what the overtone harmonic content of that recording sounds like. Because if you were to change pitch on an acoustic instrument, the harmonic overtones are not going to necessarily be consistent as they would be in a perfect environment like a synthesizer. So it's going to sound just a little bit weird, but it can be done, and you can totally do that. There's really no limit to what instrument that you want to apply this technique to get cluster chords out of it in a much more, I think, satisfying way than to just play a straightforward waveform and then just play a bunch of notes close together, because as I showed before, it's not that much of an interesting sound on its own. You want to add this kind of modulation to really spice things up, to really scare your socks off. So that is a cluster chord, or how you can make cluster chords for your scary music. So that's it for this video. Thank you for hanging out, and I will see you in another sound design video sometime soon. Have yourselves a good night, creatures. Bye-bye.